They called it the Age of Faith, but in the Spain of the late 15th century, faith didn't save you, it marked you. Beneath the gold-laced robes of monarchs and the incense-filled halls of cathedrals, another world stirred one ruled not by kings, but by fear. At the heart of it stood a thin, austere man in black unflinching, faceless to many, yet spoken of in whispers from Granada to Castile. His name was Tomás de Torquemada. To the devout, he was God's hammer. To the condemned, he was the architect of ruin. Spain was on the brink of unification. Isabella and Ferdinand dreamed of one crown, one people, one faith, but unity, under Torquemada's hand, came soaked in blood. He did not lead armies. He drafted edicts. He didn't raise a sword. He raised questions terrible, intimate questions whispered through torture, scrawled into confessions, and burned into the flesh of heretics. A nation once home to Jewish scholars, Muslim artisans, and Christian mystics became a maze of silence and betrayal. Torquemada's power was absolute. As Grand Inquisitor, he built a machine of suspicion so total that no one, not even his fellow clergy, dared question its workings. And yet, beneath his iron certainty, there was a fracture. He bore Jewish ancestry, a secret that would trail him until his final breath. In purging Spain of others, he may have been trying to purge himself. Under the slow-burning sun of 15th century Valladolid, a boy was born into a world already splintering at the seams. His name was Tomás de Torquemada, and though history would remember him in the robes of the Dominican order, his blood told a more complex story. His grandmother had been Jewish, a fact that would linger like a shadow through every room he ever entered, in an age when identity could be both a shield and a death sentence. This lineage was dangerous. Spain was still a land of many faiths, but the fabric was tearing. The violence of 1391 had left thousands of Jewish families broken, burned, or baptized. The survivors, many forcibly converted to Christianity, became known as conversos, new Christians whose every act was watched, doubted, and often despised. Torquemada grew up in this crucible. He entered the Dominican monastery at Santa Cruz in Segovia while still young, retreating into silence, discipline, and scripture. The monastery was not just a place of prayer. It was a factory for conviction, churning out men who believed heresy was a disease, and the soul of Spain had to be kept pure at all costs. Here, surrounded by candlelight and Latin chants, Torquemada forged an idea that deviation from doctrine was not a mistake, but a threat, not an error of belief, but a rebellion against order. The church gave him purpose, but it was politics that gave him reach. In 1434, the woman who would become Spain's queen, Isabella of Castile, took the throne during a time of civil unrest. Her claim was contested, her kingdom fractured, her enemies numerous. She needed allies who could offer more than swords. She needed moral authority, divine legitimacy. Torquemada stepped into her life not as a power broker, but as a confessor. His presence was quiet but unrelenting. Where others offered strategy, he offered absolutes. Where advisors suggested compromise, he invoked eternity. Isabella, raised in a deeply pious household, found in Torquemada not just a spiritual guide, but a mirror to her own sense of divine mission. Together, they would dream of a unified Spain Catholic, orderly, unyielding. And in that dream, the conversos were not citizens. They were reminders of imperfection, warnings of rot beneath the surface. To Torquemada, their outward conversion was not proof of faith, but camouflage. They were wolves in shepherd's clothing. He spoke to Isabella not of the soul's salvation, but of the nation's purity, to cleanse Spain. It was not enough to pray. The kingdom had to be purged. And so, with his council growing louder behind palace walls, a new instrument of power was imagined, a tribunal that would answer only to the crown and the cross. Not Rome, not the people. A sacred bureaucracy that could interrogate not only what you believed, but what you ate, how you lit your candles, whether you looked toward Mecca when you prayed, or abstained from pork out of habit. The mind became a battlefield, and Torquemada prepared for war. In 1478, after subtle but relentless pressure, the Vatican granted Isabella and Ferdinand the authority to establish their own Inquisition. Officially, it was to investigate heresy among the new Christians. Unofficially, it was a weapon to enforce uniformity and obedience. At its head, there could be only one man, not a cardinal, not a general, but a monk whose silence had grown heavier than the voices of kings. Tomás de Torquemada accepted the role not with ceremony, but with calculation. He saw in it the opportunity not merely to shape doctrine, but to rewrite identity itself. He began not with fire, but with structure. A national inquisition could not operate like the medieval courts of old. It needed records, procedures, a command hierarchy. From Seville to Valencia. He divided the land into districts, each with its own tribunal. He handpicked inquisitors loyal not only to faith, but to fear. The accused would never meet their accusers. Testimony could be anonymous. Confession was encouraged, but silence was fatal. Guilt, once whispered, spread like ink through parchment, and as the machinery creaked into motion. Spain began to change. Not on the surface, markets still bustled. Cathedrals still rang with hymns, but deep in its breath. Families spoke in codes. Neighbors became spies. A candle lit on the wrong night could summon a knock at the door. It was not the lash that broke people. It was the waiting, the dread, the sense that salvation itself now wore chains. In private, Torquemada remained ascetic, unbending, cloaked in the same dark habit he had worn since youth. He took no riches, accepted no titles. But he had become something far more dangerous than a man of wealth. He had become an idea, a presence behind the throne, a whisper behind every sermon, a shadow cast over every confession. His greatest tool was not fire, but fear. And in fear, he found control. Cam on banchiro. Minsachin Laifan. Body 1, Saucho Lian Machvoy Joan Mojao. Jam Baomach, Kichuyan Tiptun Hien. Gyunguyan Tong Gyong Jianan. Lan Lungva Jayaman. Jaila Fien Ban Huanchin. Noitiep Mot Matu Joan Mojao. He bore Jewish ancestry, a secret that would trail him until his final breath, in purging Spain of others. He may have been trying to purge himself, long before the robes and the titles. Tomás de Torquemada was just a child in Valladolid, born into a lineage shadowed by blood that the crown would later demand be cleansed. His grandmother had been Jewish, a quiet truth in a world growing louder with hatred by the time he was old enough to speak Latin. Spain was already unraveling. The riots of 1391 had left a legacy of forced baptisms and mass conversions. Those who survived with their lives did so without their names. They became conversos, new Christians with old blood, watched constantly for signs of relapse. No crime was needed. Suspicion was enough. Torquemada's response wasn't assimilation. It was annihilation, first inward, then outward. He entered the Dominican monastery in Segovia in his youth, folding himself into prayer and austerity. There, in the flicker of chapel candles and the silence of stone corridors, he sharpened his belief that heresy was not a matter of thought, but of infection. That error in faith spread like plague, and that to love God truly, one had to be willing to destroy what he despised. He rose in the church with quiet precision, but it was in the court of Castile where his influence metastasized. In 1474, Isabella ascended the throne, desperate to solidify her claim. She found in Torquemada not just spiritual counsel, but the language of divine certainty. He told her what no politician could, that her rule was not merely lawful, it was holy, that her enemies were not just rebels, but enemies of God, and that, in a fractured land. Only one creed could bind the nation together. He became more than her confessor. He became her conscience. And so, beneath the crosses and silks of royal chambers, they built something terrifying, a machine that would render faith a function of fear. In 1478, after calculated pressure from Torquemada, the Vatican gave Spain the right to establish its own Inquisition, one not beholden to Rome. But to the crown, the stated purpose was to investigate heresy among conversos. The real goal was control. Torquemada moved quickly. He didn't seek spectacle. He sought permanence. He structured the Inquisition like an empire within the empire, regional tribunals, secret testimonies, standardized procedures, centralized records. He trained his inquisitors not just in scripture, but in interrogation, under his direction. Suspicion became a civic duty. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Silence was treason. And those who confessed could live if they gave another name. Torquemada wasn't interested in saving souls. He was interested in reshaping Spain. To do that, he needed not just the power to punish, but the authority to define who belonged and who did not. Under Torquemada's hand, the Spanish Inquisition did not erupt in a burst of fury. It crept like fog through the alleys of cities and the corridors of homes. What he built was not merely a tribunal, it was an atmosphere. Every detail of its function was calculated to unnerve, disarm, and isolate. Spain became a country where doubt could be fatal, and silence was a scream no one could hear. The machinery began with confession. But it was a confession twisted into performance. A doctrine known as the Edict of Grace was issued in each new region before formal inquisitions began. Residents were given 30 to 40 days to voluntarily confess their errors, small habits, forgotten customs, ancient songs sung under one's breath, and in return, they would be granted mercy. But that mercy came at a cost. To confess fully, one had to name others. Those who came forward early were spared the stake. Those named later, even if innocent, were not. The effect was surgical. The trust that held communities together unraveled overnight. Families dined in quiet tension. Lovers stopped whispering. Children were told not to speak at school. It was not just heresy that was punished. It was connection. Inquisitors were trained to look for the invisible. They watched for people who washed on Fridays instead of Sundays, who refused pork at feasts, who lit candles behind closed shutters. These small choices, often born of habit or grief, became clues. A routine gesture became a dossier. Under Torquemada, theology became espionage. The inquisitor's gaze replaced the priest's comfort. The sacraments were still performed, but they now stood beside execution orders. Anonymous denunciation was encouraged. A neighbor's word, even without evidence, could launch an investigation. Those accused were arrested without notice and held without charge. Once inside the tribunal's walls, time lost meaning. The cells were cold, the corridors narrow, and every door led to silence. No defense attorney, no public trial, only a series of questions, repeated until truth gave way to survival. Torture was not a punishment, it was a method, officially. The church forbade the spilling of blood, so the Inquisition became creative. The rack, the strappado, the heretics' fork devices designed not to maim, but to break the will. The victim was told to confess not just their own crimes, but the secrets of their brother, their spouse, their oldest friend. A wrong answer led to more rope. A right one only confirmed guilt. Every session ended with a signature, and every signature became another name to hunt. Yet for all its brutality, the Inquisition was clothed in ritual. After months of silence, prisoners were brought into the light not for freedom, but for spectacle. In ceremonies known as auto da fe, entire cities gathered to witness the penance and punishment of the accused. Those spared were forced to wear San Benito's yellow robes painted with devils, and flames paraded through the streets as living warnings. Those condemned were led to the pyres, Some were strangled first, others were not. Their screams were called purification. The burnings were public, not because the church needed them, but because Torquemada did. Fire was a sermon. It taught the masses that disobedience was not an idea, it was a destination. The flames cleansed not just the sinner, but the witnesses. It reminded them that the line between the faithful and the damned was drawn not in belief, but in fear. But power leaves traces, and even Torquemada could not control every whisper, in court circles and among foreign envoys. Murmurs began to rise. There were questions about the vast fortune seized from the accused, about the precision with which certain converso families were targeted. Rumors spoke of property divided among inquisitors, of gold flowing into the church while cities grew poorer. What had begun as spiritual warfare now looked, to many, like state-sponsored looting. Torquemada did not respond. He never explained. He only expanded. Every new complaint became proof of necessary purity. Every critic was a potential heretic, and in that widening spiral, the Inquisition became not a court, but a mirror reflecting a Spain that no longer trusted itself. In the spring of 1490, whispers began to swirl across Castile. Centered on the tiny village of La Guardia, a rumor took shape: 6 conversos, accused of ritually murdering a Christian child in a clandestine ceremony. No body was found. No credible witness had ever seen the child, yet Torquemada seized on the tale with relentless force. He saw in La Guardia the perfect stage, a captured narrative that could validate his Inquisition's worst fears and justify its cruelest measures. Investigators descended on the accused with the same machinery that had already hollowed cities: anonymous denunciations, torture, and forced confessions came together in a spectacle of dread. The accused, beaten and starved, named names they could not know: neighbors, relatives, fellow clergy. The tribunal convened in public, and as the villagers of La Guardia watched, 6 men were sentenced to death. They were burned alongside effigies of alleged victims, the flames casting long shadows on cobblestone streets. The spectacle seared a lesson into the minds of ordinary people. The Inquisition's reach knew no bounds. The La Guardia case erupted through Europe: courts in France, embassies in Rome. Learned universities in Italy all questioned the veracity of the evidence. They asked, where was the child? Where were the witnesses? And why was Torquemada so quick to conclude? But within Spain, questions died under the weight of power. Isabella and Ferdinand endorsed the verdict. The church remained silent. Fear filled the spaces where doubt once lingered. 2 years later, that fear became policy. On March 31, 1492, the Alhambra Decree was signed. Every Jew in Spain, whether baptized or practicing, was ordered to leave within 4 months, no exceptions. Over the next months, roughly 150,000 people packed their belongings into donkeys, wagons, and baskets. Merchants left behind fortunes. Scholars abandoned libraries. Entire families embarked on journeys to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and Italy, along coastal roads and through mountain passes. Children grew weak and parents wept in the night. Many died before seeing refugees' camps. Their graves went unmarked. Spain celebrated the decree as a triumph of national unity. Crown and Inquisition claimed the banishment would strengthen the Catholic reign and secure peace. In Torquemada's mind, it was vindication. The converso threat had been removed, the nation purified. But the true cost lay in what Spain had lost: knowledge, commerce, creativity. Cities like Toledo became quieter, universities dimmed, new trades slowed in the following centuries. Scholars would point back to 1492 as a pivotal moment, a wound in Spain's cultural heart. Torquemada basked in the crown's approval. His face appeared on commemorative medals. His robes seemed to glow with sanctity. Yet behind the veneer of power, a whisper of doubt followed him, among his critics in the court. Some began to question whether the Inquisition had served spirituality or secular greed. How many properties had changed hands under the guise of divine obligation? How many lives were exchanged for coin and control? But Torquemada did not falter. The LaGuardia case and the expulsion decree had expanded his mission. No longer was he merely an inquisitor. He was a nation-state architect, reshaping Spain's destiny under his direction. The Inquisition moved beyond faith, entering politics, property, and policy. It became not only a spiritual authority, but a political one, its shadow stretching over every altar, every market, every quiet prayer behind closed doors. Yet power breeds isolation. By the time the decree was signed, Torquemada had already begun to fear the machinery he controlled. Paranoia crept into his private life. He surrounded himself with guards, kept his closest aides under oath, and slept with the nagging fear of betrayal. The purges had been turned outward. Now, he braced for the inward turn, and in that silence, the stage was set for the unraveling of a man who controlled fire and yet lived perpetually aflame by the final years of his life. Tomás de Torquemada was no longer the ghost behind the throne. He had become a prisoner of the very system he created. The corridors of his power had grown colder. The same network of informants he once relied upon now watched him as well. He no longer moved freely through cities he had once ruled in silence when he traveled. It was with armed guards when he spoke. It was in hushed tones, wary of servants, scribes, even fellow monks. Spain had absorbed his fear, and now it reflected it back. He retreated to Avila, a fortified town carved into the Castilian plateau. There, he ordered the construction of a chapel small, stone, and unassuming, built directly over what had once been a Jewish cemetery. It was an act few questioned aloud, but many understood. For Torquemada, this was no coincidence. It was a monument to erasure, a quiet proclamation that the old faith, the old names, the old blood, had been buried literally and spiritually beneath the new order. Inside that chapel, he spent his final years in obsessive devotion. He prayed for hours, eyes closed, fingers trembling, lips muttering litanies that echoed in the vault. He fasted until his body withered. The man who once stood before monarchs now walked hunched, his steps slow, his skin gray with sickness and sleeplessness. He was not forgotten, but he was no longer embraced. The crown had shifted its attention to empire building. Granada had fallen. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic. Spain was now looking outward. Torquemada belonged to an older Spain, one drenched in fire and ash. Rumors multiplied. Whispers of his Jewish ancestry resurfaced, more vicious now, as if Spain itself needed one last irony to complete the circle. The man who had purged conversos now faced the same accusations. His birth, his blood, his silence, everything was reconsidered. Some claimed he had burned those who reminded him of himself. Others said he had overreached not in zealotry, but in shame. But no accusations ever reached the courtroom. He was untouchable, even as he wasted away. His mind wandered, in his writings, from this period. There is no trace of regret, no apology, only a gnawing anxiety that the work remained unfinished, that heresy was still hiding in Spain's heart, that somewhere in the alleys of Toledo or the vineyards of La Rioja, a candle was being lit in secret, that someone, somewhere, was whispering the old prayers again. His death came quietly on September 16th, 1498. He was 78. There were no public processions, no mourners lining the streets. His body was placed in the chapel he had built atop the cemetery he had erased. The irony lingered, unspoken but heavy, in the heart of a country he had tried to purify. He was buried on the bones of those he had condemned. He left behind no children, no portrait, no heir to his name. Only the system he built remained cold, meticulous, and very much alive. The Inquisition would continue for centuries, long after his bones had turned to dust. It would stretch into the New World, into the colonies, into every place Spain laid claim. It would find new targets: Protestants, mystics, scholars, women. But its spirit remained unchanged, suspicion institutionalized, belief weaponized, mercy withheld. In the end, Torquemada was not consumed by the fire he lit. He was consumed by the silence that followed it, by the stillness of rooms where names were once spoken in fear, by the echo of footsteps in corridors where no one dared look back. He died, believing he had saved Spain's soul. History would ask if he had merely traded it for order. The system Torquemada built outlived him by more than 3 centuries. In 1834, long after his name had faded from sermons and scrolls, the Spanish Inquisition was officially dismantled. But the shadow it cast remained etched not just into court records and execution sites, but into the psychology of a nation that had learned to fear what it could not question. What Torquemada left behind was not only a legal machine of persecution, but a cultural trauma so deeply rooted that it reshaped Spain's relationship with knowledge, memory, and identity. Economically, the damage was undeniable. The expulsion of Jews in 1492 had hollowed out Spain's intellectual and mercantile classes. Centuries of integration of Jewish physicians, financiers, translators, craftsmen were erased in months. The wealth seized by the Inquisition filled royal treasuries for a time, but the long-term cost was stagnation, as other European powers began to nurture printing presses, fund universities, and embrace exploration with scientific fervor. Spain turned inward. Paranoia replaced innovation. Orthodoxy replaced inquiry. And in that silence, progress suffocated. Abroad, the Inquisition traveled with Spanish flags and Catholic missionaries. It followed conquistadors into the Americas, embedding itself in the colonial project. It policed indigenous belief systems, silenced resistance, and rebranded spiritual traditions as sorcery. The same tools once used to interrogate conversos were now repurposed for the New World against enslaved Africans, native priests, and settlers with unorthodox interpretations of faith. The reach of Torquemada's invention now stretched across oceans, leaving scars in lands he would never see. In the cities he once haunted, the physical traces of the Inquisition began to disappear. Torture chambers were converted into cellars. Inquisitorial palaces were repurposed into government offices. But remnants persisted in place names, in whispered family histories, in the reluctance of generations to speak too freely. The fear he instilled had become cultural inheritance. Even those who knew nothing of Torquemada still moved through his aftershocks. Some historians portray him as a man of his time, driven by duty, consistent with the Church's worldview, a servant of orthodoxy rather than an architect of cruelty. Others place him in a darker lineage, a forerunner of state terror, who understood how ideology and bureaucracy could be fused to normalize violence. The meticulous records of the Inquisition, its ledgers, confessionals, property logs anticipate the files of modern police states. They reveal not just what was done, but how easily it became routine. For the Jewish people of Spain, Torquemada's name would become a symbol not just of oppression, but of betrayal. His own ancestry rendered his actions unbearable in their irony. Generations of Spanish Jews and conversos spoke of him in hushed contempt, a man who turned his back on blood in the name of salvation. To them, his Inquisition was not just a campaign of purification, it was a campaign of erasure. And yet, despite the exile, the forced conversions, and the centuries of silence, Sephardic Jewish culture survived. It flourished in Istanbul, Thessaloniki, Amsterdam, and across North Africa. Their songs, languages, and traditions endured, a quiet defiance against the machinery that tried to erase them. What remains of Torquemada today is not a tomb visited by pilgrims. It is not a statue or a sainthood. He left behind no hagiography, no canonization. What survives are documents cold, methodical, signed in ink and fear, and a cultural scar that still throbs in Spain's collective memory. He believed he was saving a soul, but in doing so, he taught the world how dangerous salvation could become when wielded without mercy. History did not forget him. It remembered him exactly as he feared it would, not as a saint, not even as a villain, but as a warning. Centuries passed, but the name Torquemada refused to die. It moved from parchment to legend, from courtroom to classroom, embedded not only in historical records, but in the language of terror. Across Europe and the Americas, his name became shorthand for cruelty cloaked in righteousness, a figure invoked whenever conscience was crushed by bureaucracy, whenever power was defended through purity. And yet, even now, his story remains incomplete. It is both history and myth, fact and parable, studied with cold detachment or burning judgment depending on who speaks his name. For some, especially within academic and theological circles, Torquemada is re-examined as a reflection of his time, an agent of a church and monarchy fighting to solidify a fractured identity in the wake of centuries of religious pluralism. He emerges in some texts not as a monster, but as a man burdened by an impossible mission, whose rigidity mirrored the chaos around him. His policies, while brutal, are sometimes framed as expressions of loyalty to faith, to order, to empire. That framing itself has become controversial. It raises questions not just about him, but about how societies sanitize violence when it's aligned with tradition. In Jewish memory, however, Torquemada is remembered with a different clarity. His image is not softened by scholarship or theology. He stands beside the figures who cast shadows across centuries of exile, a man who weaponized identity, who made heritage a liability, who turned private rituals into criminal acts. He is remembered not for what he thought he was doing, but for what he did, turning neighbors into enemies, prayer into suspicion, survival into silence. His legacy haunts the spaces he tried to empty. The synagogues he closed have been rebuilt in cities he never imagined. The families he forced from Castile and Aragon now trace their roots across continents. In modern Spain, movements to recognize the descendants of expelled Jews to offer citizenship, to restore stolen history, carry the echoes of his name in every document signed. What he tried to erase now insists on being remembered, not as revenge, as presence. Even within Catholicism, Torquemada is an unsettled figure. The Church never canonized him, never offered him the posthumous honors bestowed on others of his rank. His influence was too heavy, too difficult to separate from the political violence it enabled. He is studied in seminaries not as a saint, but as a caution-proof that even within sacred structures, evil can be methodical, tireless, and disturbingly devout. The Inquisition he led has been examined by legal historians as a prototype of totalitarian control. Long before the surveillance states of the 20th century, Torquemada's network of informants and secret tribunals showed how paranoia could be institutionalized. The architecture of fear he designed, the secret hearings, the denial of defense, the public rituals of punishment have been echoed in regimes from Stalin's purges to McCarthy's trials. His name, once tied only to religion, has crossed into the secular, studied in political science and ethics classes, dissected not for his faith, but for his function. He belongs now to a wider conversation: how belief can be turned into machinery, how ideology can mask ambition, how certainty can breed brutality. He is no longer just a figure of the Spanish past. He is a reference point, a way of measuring the distance between power and justice. Torquemada may have died in a stone chapel far from court, but the echo of his voice, his edicts, his judgments, still vibrate through the centuries. His life is a mirror held up to systems that claim virtue as justification for control. A warning not because of what he believed, but because of what he proved that when fear is sanctified, even silence can burn in the end. Torquemada left behind no heirs, no memoirs, no final confession, only silence and paper. Thousands of pages stamped with his seal, detailing names, confessions, flames. A nation reshaped not through war, but through fear, signed in ink, his mission, cloaked in salvation, carved deep into the memory of Spain and beyond. Generations lived in the shadows of his verdicts, some never knowing his name, yet carrying the consequences of his choices. His story is a fracture in the timeline of faith and power, a moment when certainty became cruelty, and devotion disguised destruction. He was not the first to weaponize belief, nor the last, but he was precise, unyielding, and in his stillness, he became unforgettable. Was he a true believer, lost in a warped sense of duty, or a man who buried his own bloodline beneath robes and rituals centuries later? His name still forces us to look again at who holds power, who defines purity, and who pays the price for both. The record remains, and perhaps that is the punishment, not flames, not exile, but being remembered exactly as he was, without mercy, without myth,